Hello and welcome to another training video for ProppFrexx on Air. This time I would like to talk about histories, and I very often get the question, how do I ensure that the same artist or the same title or the same track, the same album whatsoever is not being repeated too often in my scripted playlist? So there are various settings, we have multiple histories, and everything can get very confusing, and that's why I would like to talk about the history settings within ProppFrexx on Air. So first of all, and this is also the default setting when you freshly install ProppFrexx on Air, there is only the global history activated. Actually not exactly with the same settings as I've set that up now, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So the global history can be found in the general settings under the section logging and history, and down here you have the history settings. First of all, it is very important to understand that there is a history playlist, which is currently set to 50 tracks, and there's a global song history, which is currently set to 100 tracks. So the history playlist has nothing to do with history checking. This is a playlist, a historic playlist of played items, and they're only used for information purpose, and they are only used to validate actually your web settings. For example, you can create a template from this history and upload that to your website so that you can get the playlist history also reflected on your website. So the history playlist has nothing to do with history settings. That's very important to understand. For the history playlist, you can also define that you want to exclude certain tracks, and the same you can do for the global song history. So, for example, I have defined that every advertising track, meaning every track that is tagged with the entry type advertising, is not being treated in any global history chatting or validation whatsoever. So I exclude everything advertising. And I'm coming later in a few minutes to the point and show you where you can define the media type, because the media type is very important to understand. So nevertheless, I have defined the global song history to be 100, to contain 100 tracks. And then I have a More button, which I can click now to define advanced history settings. So you can basically define these attributes here to fine-grain how the history check is performed. First of all, you can define if an extended history check should be enabled. This is enabled by default and means that also the album, artist, and title, and even the artist cross-check is being performed. Else, if you would disable this, no album, title, or whatsoever checks are being performed. Only the tracks based on the track names are checked. So this is typically not what you want, so keep the extended history check enabled. In addition, you can enable a force tag reading option, and this means that if any metadata is missing, then ProppFrexx tries to get this metadata on the fly and performs a tag reading for entries where the tag reading haven't been performed yet. So you can also safely keep this option on. And then you have 3 buttons next to the album, artist, and title check, which means use strict checks. By default, they are disabled, meaning relaxed check is performed. And a relaxed check means that there are certain keywords and separator characters being used. Like, for example, within the artist, if you have an artist name, I give you an example, Madonna featuring Sting, then this keyword featuring is being used to separate and actually treat the same single artist as 2 artists. So a duplicate check against Madonna and a duplicate check against Prince is being performed. So there's a list of predefined keywords like featuring, versus, meets, and, as well as there are certain separator characters like the comma, the semicolon, the forward slash. And all these keywords and separator characters are being treated when you use the relaxed check, and then on each individual item the history check is being performed. So, but what is more important even is the numbers you define in here. First of all, remember that the overall global song history is in my example set to 100 tracks, and then I can define for each album, artist, and title check a lower number, of course, or I can even specify the number of minutes which I want to ensure that an artist is not being repeated or an album or title is not being repeated. And now This is very, very important because you always have to keep in mind how big your media libraries you're using are. I just give you a stupid example. In my example, I have set the artist check to 45 tracks or 100 minutes, whatever comes first. In my example, I guess the 45 tracks will be the bigger matching feature. So now what will happen if I only have a media library with, let's say, 20 tracks in it? Then my whole global song history would be useless, because it is very likely that all 20 tracks are, after a certain time, are being contained in my global song history. And as such, that media library would always fail that check. So your global song history should cover your general settings, and then we might need to define exceptions for those media libraries who contain less tracks. So if you're performing an artist check against to ensure that 45 artists are not being repeated in the history, then you need to have media libraries who are large enough and containing more than 45 distinct artists. Otherwise, this media library is a candidate to always fail the validation, because there is no track matching any history check option you have to find, and as such, it cannot be actually pass through the global song history check. So keep that in mind. I'm coming to that later on as well. So in my example, I've defined the global song history quite large, and I'm checking that the last 10 tracks are not containing the same album, that the last 45 tracks do not contain any of the relaxed checking artists. I even perform a cross-artist check against the album artist field. So I want to ensure that not only the artist, but also the album artist field is not matching against the last 45 tracks. And I'm ensuring that the last 10 tracks do not contain the same title. Right. Okay, so let's now take a look to the script, and let me explain what is happening with a related script. So I've already prepared a script library for you, which I'm using in this demo, just opening them up, and it only contains 4 script lines. So the whole history checking is anyhow only performed if you schedule something from your script, so meaning you are using the script. So if you're using an external scheduling tool like Music Master, Music One, Power Gold, whatsoever you're using, then of course the external tool needs to check and validate all these rules. ProppFrexx isn't doing that, so the whole global history check is only performed if you're using the built-in scripting engine and scheduling engine. Okay, so now let's take a look to these 4 script lines. The first one just picks a random track from this media library. Random track is from this library, a least times played track from that media library, and a random track from that media library. Just 4 stupid media libraries with no specific meaning. So let's take a look to the media libraries and how big they are. If you open up the entry type, you will see that there's a number behind each media library displayed, and this number actually shows how many tracks are contained. So remember, my global history was set to 100 tracks or 45 artists, for example. And this one contains 7,613 tracks, so it's very unlikely that there's any duplicate in there. So this row is perfectly fine. Next row, 23,000 entries, 627. So that media library also contains way enough tracks to not validate any history check. Now the next library. Oh, here we have a quite good candidate. Look at that. This media library only contains 57 entries. Okay, so what does this now mean in terms of history checking? If I have a media library with only 57 entries, but my history is set to 100 tracks. So it is very, very likely that this script line will not pass my global history check because it contains too few entries. So there are a couple of options which you now have. The first option you already see here. You can specify suppress history check. And if you define this suppress history check, then for this single small script line here, the entire validation of the global history is being suppressed, which means it just skipped. But that also has some consequences, because, for example, if this media library contains a track from stay with the example Madonna, it might also be that the previous script line might have just scheduled also a Madonna track. And as we skipped any history checking for this line, theoretically the result might be that 2 Madonna tracks are being played subsequently. And this is not good. So what options do you have now? Because if you specify suppress history check, then it really means a least times played track in this example is being picked from that media library without any additional check. So of course you have a few options. The first option is the following. You might theoretically define a script related history, and up here you will see the settings. So as I'm using a quite small media library, I might define a quite small history setting for the script. And as you can see, when I click on options, you almost find exactly the same settings, and I can just use lower numbers in here to just make sure that probably at least the script history check is not violating here. So what does that mean for my scripts now here? It is still the case that it might still be the case that this track returns Madonna, and if I still keep this suppress history check on, even this script history is not being executed. But there is a small trick. You might see this little entry here, force library history check. And if you enable in addition this option, then this means globally the song history check is being suppressed. But I force the library history check. And library history check, if I force, that means if I keep both options checked, that the global history check is being suppressed, but in my case here now, if I enable both, at least the library, meaning also the script library validation takes place. So now what I'm ensuring is that 2 histories are being active. The global one plus the script history one. Which means that for this entry now, at least the history of the song of the script is being checked. And as I only define this to contain 10 entries, then at least for this script line it is ensured that not the same tracks is being repeated, the last 10 tracks are not being repeated, and at least the last 5 artists. I could also define this to 7 or even increase that a little bit, like for example I can put this to 25 and this one to I don't know, 15 if I know that at least I have 15 distinct artists in my small media library, then I can even increase this number a little bit. So you can really much fine-grain the settings now with your global history. And in my example now I have for all other rows, for all other script lines, I'm using the global history, but only for this one I suppress the global history but still use the script history. Okay, so what does that now mean if I'm really having multiple programs being scheduled? Let's assume every 2 hours you schedule a new program and you're using every 2 hours a different script. Remember, this is a script-related history. And as such, if I switch the hour, then a new script, a new program might start, and as such the very last track being played in the previous program from the previous script might now not be validated against this script because I'm starting a new program with a new script. So the script history is only in scope of that script when it's been executed within that program it is associated to, but not between 2 programs. So there is still a very, very slight chance that theoretically the very last track here is being scheduled from Madonna, and when the new program is starting and is just playing the next track, that the very first track of the next program of another script also schedules from a very small media library, again initially the first track, which is also only performing only a history check against the script, and is also picking up Madonna. It is very unlikely in my case now, but there might be a theoretical chance. So what can I do then? And just to remember you, if if I wouldn't use suppress here at all, what now might happen, and this is very important to understand, if I wouldn't specify anything like this, and just say, look, okay, perform the history check and even the global one here for this script line, and when the media library contains only a few entries, it's very important to understand that by default, this script line is just being skipped. So if there is no track to fulfill the global history checking rules which I've defined, then this script line is simply being skipped. And this is typically not what you want. You want to force the script to really execute every line. Except you really understand what you're doing and say, yes, that's true, that's all fine. If this script violates all history checks, then it is perfectly fine that the system can skip this line. So understand that if you don't specify anything here, you're in risk of skipping this line. And if you haven't specified any options here, now you just click OK to save the script. Oh, you will even get a warning. And the warning is all about, maybe some of you have already seen this warning. This warning is just to tell you, oh yes, line 3, least times played from that media library, is a possible candidate for a history count conflict. Exactly, because the history count, the global one, is bigger than the media library you're using. Do you want to save anyhow? I say no. I don't want to save. I want to make sure that really a track is being picked, because that might be a script line where, for example, you're picking tracks from your heavy rotation list and you really want that a heavy rotation track is being played. So, as said, in this case, just enable these two options, and in 99% of your cases you're done. You're now using a script history, which is perfectly fine. But I said there's a very minimal chance that the next program might start with the same artist. Is there any other options? Yes, there are. If you go back to your logging and history setting, you might have noticed that there's also something called global restrictions. So what is that? In the global restrictions, you can define even more restrictions. First of all, you can define restrictions which look back a freely definable number of tracks back in your history, and which might apply to certain script lines. They're here being listed. And then you define a condition. So in this example, just open up another browser, I have defined a condition saying if the genre contains pop, then the condition is met. So what does this restriction line now mean? It's a global scope, so it relates to all scripts being running. If the condition is meeting, I'm looking back 9 tracks back. And if within the look back, within the last 9 tracks, I'm just scheduling a new script line, which is about to be queried. This is important to understand. And if this now meets this criteria, and also I find this criteria in the last 9 tracks, then I reject the current being scheduled script line. So what does that mean? With this script line, I can ensure that I'm not playing a pop track, a track with a genre pop, within the last 9 tracks. So pop can only be repeated at minimum every 10th track. This is what this rule is about. I can even add another rule, which is based on a script line level. And let's just define something. I also said it only applies to any sequential or random script line, and this includes also the least times played or least recently placed items. And now I can click on this question mark here to define the rule. And my rule might be, I just add a new rule saying my current artist should not contain, and now I can use even a macro. I can even type in a value, should not be contain Madonna. So I want to make sure that Madonna is not being played the last, let's say, 10 tracks and being repeated the last 10 tracks. So every 10th track could only be then a Madonna track. Or I can use a macro. I can even say artist, which is a classical track macro, and the track macros and all other macros are listed in the user manual. So this is my condition, artist contains $artist. And remember, this restriction has always been fired whenever a script is just about to schedule a new track. So the artist of that new track is being taken and validated against the countback number of tracks in the history. And countback is given here. So here I can specify, for example, 10. And now I can ensure that the current artist which is about to be scheduled is validated against the last 10 tracks in the history. And if they somehow match, the artist of the current track is equal to the artist of the 10 history tracks back, then this script line based restriction is actually failing. And if a script line related restriction is failing, means that current track which is about to be scheduled is not being used. And for global scope, it means the current being scheduled track is just being rejected and the script continues. This is equal to skipping a script line. If I set the scope to script line directly, then the script line is executed again. And this is not being executed all over. There is a certain maximum limit, which is half of the size of the media libraries. And after these retries, I then say, okay, I give up. There are no really tracks being contained there in this script line which validate any restriction. But remember, if I have a small media library and if I define this number small enough, I can use additional checks. However, this check is not using the relax check. This artist contains the current artist value is a direct match validation. If you want to do something more, I just remove that one because there is a special line down here. See this line. Do not repeat an equal artist within the last 10 tracks. Oh, here you have a global rule already defined exactly for your needs, because I know that artist can contain multiple artists, this field. For all others, like title or genre, this is classically not the case, but for artists, this is the case. And here I can directly specify, okay, look back in the history, the last 10 tracks, and these conditions and restrictions down here are really also on a script line level. So this little setting also ensures that in addition to the global history settings, I will make sure that an artist is never repeated for the last 10 tracks. And this restriction comes in really handy if I'm using small media libraries where I cannot ensure the setting. So just going back, I have defined this one here to my script. I might theoretically now go back to my script and say, well, you know what? Here, I don't want to use a script-related history because I don't know what a script history is doing. Okay, so if I really don't want to use a script history, I can disable this, and then I just maybe only use the suppress history check. And remember, as I told you before, now the global validation is not being executed, so a track is always taken from here. And that means the previous line might have scheduled a Madonna track, and this one might also schedule a Madonna track. So, but now, if this is the case now, because I'm not performing any history check at all now, suppress all history checks, then these restrictions come into place, because the restrictions are carried out and validated also always. And these are here also validated on a script line level. So even if I suppressed on a script line level the history check, the restriction check is being carried out regardless, because I've defined them in here. So this means, yes, the last 10 tracks are validated and that the artist is not the same. So if I set this number small enough to match my smallest media library, then this check is in addition being carried out. And this is very, very helpful for your history checks. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us recap. The global restrictions work pretty much the same as the global song history, and they work in addition, and they also work if you suppress the history check within a script line. So they also fall back for media libraries and script lines, which uses media libraries which are very small, and as such, the global history is suppressed, but only then the global scripting restrictions do work and might do an artist check on lower numbers matching your smallest media library. So take care of this number, that you also don't set this too high. Okay, any other histories we have to consider? We have now looked at the global song history, at the script history, at the global restrictions, and there's also a media library history. Let's first take a look to the general settings, folder, and libraries. This is often very much wrongly used or misunderstood. Here we have an auto playlist path, and here the same for the cartwalls. One's for media libraries and one for cartwall libraries. This automatic playlist path is actually a path you only have to set if you would like to load all playlists which are contained in that folder as automatically being converted into media libraries. So all playlists contained in that path here are being used as automatic media libraries. Same for cartwall libraries. And by the way, we have the same down here for scripts, the automatic script library path. All these three automatic library paths you typically never use, because it is always more advised to always use the additional media library so that you have manual control of all the media libraries or script libraries you're editing. But if you use those automatic libraries, then this song history value is just the default value for those media libraries. So if I click on additional media libraries, the same dialog comes up as if I would click them up from up here of the ribbon bar. Nevertheless, each media library, if I, for example, double click and edit one, has here also a history value. And I just click cancel. And this song history is the default value, because there you cannot edit anything. These values are all here default values for media libraries which are automatically being loaded. As said, typically leave these fields empty, don't use them, because then you exactly know what you're doing. You're manually managing your media libraries. So let's take a look back to a media library. A media library also has a history, and this is your last resort. A media library history only performs a check on the track, on the file itself, and it's very rarely used, and it's actually from times where you automatically load and automatically watch certain media libraries with very few entries, and you want to make sure that always only the very last entries or a couple of very last entries are being used, and therefore you can specify a media library history. In all cases, if you don't know what to do with it, never use it. Okay, so leave it to 0. Just here to explain you what is all there. So please, let's recap. I'm going back to my example script. We have the global history settings, and define the global history settings with all your values as you want to have them by default. For example, do not repeat artists within the last 45 tracks. But if you're using a media library with a very small number of tracks in it, less than the numbers you're given in your global history, then make sure to use the suppress history check. If you use suppress history check, be ensured that this media library or this script line might be skipped, because no entry in that media library might validate against the global history. If you don't want that and want this line to be executed, live with the fact and don't suppress the history check. That maybe duplicate artists or tracks might be repeated, or use the force library history check flag, in which case the script history up here is being used. Or if you also don't want to use a script history, just suppress the history, and then everything, even if this is suppressed, falls back to your global restrictions. And then you have the ability in your global restrictions to define a very small number, so that at least for those media libraries it is ensured that the last X, in this case 10 artists, are not being repeated. Or define any other condition for your restrictions in here. Okay, I hope now you get an idea of the script settings, about the global history, about the script history, your restrictions, and how they work. There's one more word to say, because I'm also very often asked, like, how can I ensure that, for example, when I'm scheduling a jingle, that not 2 jingles are being played subsequently, especially when I'm dealing with overlays. And there's also a few settings which I would like to show you at the end. So go back to your general sections and then go back to your history. First of all, note that you have rule sets. Rule sets are there on an individual track basis. You can define rules. Let's assume I just create a new rule, and one rule can consist of various conditions, and here you can specify time or date related restrictions that you, for example, want to say there's a rule saying don't play this track during Christmas, don't play this track on the weekend, don't play this track in morning hours. So you can define any number of rules, and then I just close those rules because I've only defined one. You can go to a track. Let's maybe take a look in my track board, because there I don't know, have one track. Yeah, here's one Angie Stone track. And I can just open up the tag editor. So you can open up the tag editor from wherever you want. Go to the Others tag, and here you can assign rules to, and here you can also edit those rules, just as I shown you on the general settings. Here you can assign rules by just typing them in and selecting them. You can assign rule sets to a single track. So if you want to use rule sets like don't play this track on Mondays or on weekends or in the morning hours, then you need to assign those rules to each and every single track individually. It's a bit of work, but there's no other way around. And in addition, you can also place some certain other restrictions in here, like don't play this particular track exactly on that day, on that time, etc. Don't repeat that track within the next X days. So a couple of rules are per track also possible to define here. And then don't forget to save the metadata to the file so that they're persistently stored with the file for each and for everyone. Okay, now to the last and final setting. As I tried to explain, you often have the problem that the overlay player might be ending with a jingle because you defined it that way, and you want to make sure that the scripting didn't place already a jingle as a subsequent track. And this is possible down here in the script and scheduler settings within the general settings. And down here you have a suppress filter. And when you use the suppress filter, you can select certain media entry types which you want to be sure that they are not played right after an overlay. So whenever something is played through the overlay player, and it is only used through the overlay player, and it is detected within the current playlist that when the overlay player finishes, the next track would be one of these tracks. As you can see, I selected almost everything except music. Then those tracks are being ejected in the playlist, are being marked as played and not being effectively played. So this is a suppress filter. In order to make this suppress filter active, select all those media entry types, plus then within your overlay scheduler, I just open one and select a few entries down here. Maybe I do use that just one. Make sure that you use this little flag here, apply suppress filter. This option also needs to be defined within the overlay. Only if this flag is set for an overlay entry, then the suppress filter is really being activated. Okay, that's for now. So you have seen that a lot of entries are related to media entry types, and just to make sure that you understood where you can define them, on the track data you always have a type up here, and here you define the media entry type. They're a fixed list, but there are like over 65 entries in there and a couple of user definable, so you for sure will find the right media entry type, and for each media entry type you can define suppress filters, etc. pp. So that is very important. Define them here, and then again make sure to save them to your physical file. Otherwise, if you just click save here, then they're just stored to that local playlist. Okay, thanks for listening. I hope you now get an idea about how history settings are working, and if not, just watch this video again, and hopefully with the second time everything will be clear again. Thanks for listening.